How's it going, YouTube? Comments in today's another video, and today, guys, so the brand new is going to be the meta tier list for the YCS Orlando format that we're going to be going into post Suda. Suda is going to be really cool. We have the newest set after that, which is ALIN, and that format is going to be bonkers. But I'm excited for that. I'm excited for this format. I'm excited for Orlando. Let me know down below in the comment section if I'm going to see you there. Feel free to come up to me. Say hello. I love meeting everyone. It's a great time. So definitely go ahead and do so. This is one of those things, too, where we have to take a good look at the meta, figure out what's going to be the best choice, and then go from there. I really want to be able to update these as much as possible, like at least once a month on a meta tier list, just to kind of show you what's going on. And especially this one in particular, I think that our top decks kind of move back and forth. Like, objectively, Ryzeal Fiendsmith is still the best deck in the format, but I feel like Malice is creeping up, dude. Like, I feel like it's almost there, right? Like, it's still 20% away in tops, but it's like they're so close to each other, you know? And I'm like, one of these days, like, something crazy is gonna happen and Malice is just gonna be the better deck. But until then, right, like, Sprite was very dominant over tier until people figured out tier, right? So I feel like we could see that in the future. Who knows? We could. But let's hop into the tier list and talk about what we could see coming up. So again, I say this all the time. Please do not pick up tier if you are not ready to cry once you get shifted and put a ton of time into testing. And this deck, it's rough to play. It is so rough to play. Coming from the tier guy, it is rough to play, especially right now. It's in Rogue. I'd almost want to put it in Don't, which makes me sad, but even I put it down, right? And you could find success with tier, but it's like the other decks that are better than tier right now are so much better that it's hard to justify playing anything else at the moment. And you'll see what I mean when we get to like the 1s and 1.5s. There's just other ones that are better. Now, Rescue Ace, I believe, is a tier 2 deck. If you want to pick up something that's going to be very solid right now and give you a really good chance at doing at least okay at an event, maybe not like really well, but at least okay, Rescue Ace is definitely an option. At the Rogue option, we have tier already. At tier 2, we have Rescue. So definitely a couple decks where you could pick them up and hypothetically you could do pretty well. But I'm not really expecting crazy results out of either deck right now. Same with White Forest. Right now, White Forest is just Rogue in my opinion. Obviously, once we get the new support, it's going to be a lot higher. But like, for now, the deck isn't really impressive. It's not doing anything. If you're going to play like the runic cards with it, Detonator says hello. You know, it becomes really tough to be able to play a deck like this right now. But soon, it's going to be a very good deck. So pick up your cards now, because once we get the new shit, it's going to be very good. It's going to be very, very good. Ubel, it's 1.5. I don't really feel like we have to talk too much about Ubel. It's not really seeing a ton of play right now, but when it does, it's pretty good. It's hard to play without the Phantoms just at your leisure, right? Because you had multiple copies that you could kind of just like combo with, but now that you can't just like throw them in the garbage, kind of rough, because sometimes you just need the extra body, and if you don't have it, it's like, you know, it's kind of tough. So Ubel's a great deck right now. Fiendsmith cards are great in this deck, but be careful when you play this deck, because if you just like burn your Phantom and you're like, man, I want to get rid of this, you get rid of it, and then you get hit with like Nib or something, feels awful. So just make sure that you're aware when you're playing this deck. It's really hard to combo through a lot of the different situations that you'll find right now. As Tenpai being a deck right now, I would not refer to it as like a pure deck. I would say it's probably more so just like the Tenpai Fiendsmith deck, and that would be 1.5. The deck is still very good with the Fiendsmith cards, and it can still kill you, right? Like, it's still going to do Tenpai things. I lost to it at the last regional. It does Tenpai things, right? So it's one of those things where the deck needed something else now to really latch onto and do well with. We also saw the Malice list that got top 8 at a regional that was siding into Tenpai. Your opponent Lancias you post side and you're like, bet, right? Like, you just go summon Pydra. It's kind of gross, but it's kind of funny. And definitely a very cool option that I saw with that list too. Branded, it's probably just in Rogue. Like, it's not really doing anything that's like oppressive. It's still like okay, but it's not gonna do like that great. maybe you'll get away with some cool things if you summon, like, the Lad, right? And you have, like, a couple different options. But, like, as of right now, the deck really isn't doing anything. So it's not really something that I would have on my radar, especially if you're already playing Bell and Bistros and Ash, right? And then if you're playing, like, certain Malice builds, you're already playing Impulse. You'll have a really good time into this matchup. But it's still just, like, at a really rough point where, like, I couldn't justify bringing this deck to an event ever. The next one up here is going to be Melodious. I know that a lot of people in my comment section are like, how do you put Melodious so high? But it's still top of tier 2 to me. This deck is still very strong. I think the deck is still fairly annoying to deal with. A ton of room for non-engine. Can still play the Purge. It can still play the Arius, which is protecting the board. The Etoile is still very annoying to clear. It has Herald of the Orange Light. So it's still very strong in my opinion. It's also like $10 for the deck. So I think that's still a really good option if you want to pick something up and play this format. Still a valid option as far as right now. Mitsurugi. I know I'm going to get a lot of hate for this, but, like, honestly, if we're talking about, like, Mitsurugi Ryzeal or just, like, Mitsurugi, it's, like, top of tier 2. It's, like, bottom of tier 1.5, but it's, like, top of tier 2. I think people play this deck, but I also think they get bodied playing this deck. Like, it's cool, but the second that you're not playing a bunch of other reptiles, you literally need to be able to make a rank 4 and open prayer. So, like, it's not very strong. I think as an engine, it's very cool, and it's a very minimal engine. You play, like, one of each main deck monster, like, one of each ritual, 3 prayers, and a ritual spell, which is dope, but, like, the deck doesn't really do that much. Like, I'd rather be on a Fiendsmith variant than play this. I'd probably even play, like, the Yubel deck before this. It's not something that's going to be, like, that crazy. On hype, like, when it gets released, it'll be a little expensive, but I expect it to trickle off pretty fast. And then it'll just become, like, some kind of engine index. So don't expect this to be, like, super wild. Like, honestly, if we're talking about anything right now, I would play Voiceless Voice. The end of tier 1.5, beginning of 2, but above Mitsurugi, I would play VV. This deck is really cool. You can play like a small Ryzeal package in it. Still very consistent and still deals with the Molcharmies very well. So, in my opinion, if you want something that's going to require a very high ceiling and a lot of very thought-willing lines that you're going to have to play, this is a deck that you can get a lot of value off of. And it's not like super expensive right now, but I'm probably always picking Voiceless Voice before I play Mitsurugi, to be honest with you. The next one up here is going to be Flu. I'm going to put this in Don't right away. Everyone's citing 3 Perulia right now. Droll is going to be around next format because of things like Mitsurugi and everything else is going on. Flu has not been good for a moment. Like, it has not been good for a while. So that is one thing where I would say just don't play this deck. It is not very good. Maybe one day it gets its chance to shine again. I hope not. But as of right now, this deck is just not good. Centurion, bottom of tier 2. It's okay. If you play against Detonator, you lose. But, like, if you go first, you could probably do something, which is, like, fine. There's just, like, other things right now in the format that I'm like, I would play those before Centurion. I think Centurion's, like, really cool, and it has a lot of options, but, like, not, like, that great. And the next one here would be, like, Drytron, Drolls, Shifters, Impulses, Unfortunate Situations, Detonators. Like, it's just too much for this deck. So, like, right now we're in a really weird situation where, like, some of these old decks that always end up coming back, like, weirdly, you'll, like, see them. I don't really think they have the opportunity right now. Just because of the amount of non-engine that we're playing right now in these decks are just absolutely hating on these different decks. And they're just getting crossfired, really. It's unfortunate, but at the end of the day, it is what it is, right? Like, Drytron just cannot compete in an environment like this right now. And I think that's perfectly fine as it is. You know what I think would be really cool? If we got, like, Brilliant Fusion back and you could dump Alpha off Brilliant Fusion, then normal summon Eva or Diviner. That would be crazy. But until then, you know, we'll have to wait and see. The next one up here is going to be Chimera Fiendsmith. This deck is like okay. Again, same problems. Shifter, you have the Drolls, Impulses, Hand Traps in general, just kind of dumpster this deck. And it's not very impressive. I think that like the Azamina list post Suda could be a little better, and that's why I placed it a little higher. But like otherwise, I would have just put this in Rogue. But I do have a lot of promise for the Azamina Fiendsmith Chimera list. I think that those could be really cool. We'll have to wait and see. But I do think that those could end up being at least a thought of something that's going to be in the room. The next one up here is going to be Kashtira. This one's going to be Kashtira Fiendsmith. This is going to be up at like 1.5, top of like tier 2. It's probably honestly just right next to the Tenpai list, because like some lists are even playing like Tenpai Kashtira Fiendsmith, or just like separately. I think they're both fine. We're still seeing them in the room. We're seeing them a lot. The Unicorn alone still holds a lot of value, and Fenrir isn't bad. It's just like a lot less good than we're used to Fenrir being, because there's just other cards right now that I feel like just threaten a lot more, i.e. Druisworm. That's why people are playing a ton of them right now, because they just want to keep trying to bait out Cross or hit the detonator. And it's funny when we see a format where something like Druisworm is just more valuable than a Fenrir. Although, there are certain situations where Fenrir hits board and you're like, like, this is gonna suck, right? Like, this is not gonna be good. And that's where Paradise comes into play, and that's why Fenrir becomes even less good. Or even Unicorn. You summon one, they go Paradise and send it, right? And then you're like, man, I hope I have Thrust or Talent right now. Or another copy. So, it gets a little awkward, and that's where these are a little less good. But I still think that they're worthwhile going into the new format. Fiendsmith by itself, we were talking more of this as like a Fiendsmith pile with like these two. It's not really just going to be like Fiendsmith by itself. It's more of like the control deck, so I'm just going to throw this with these two, just kind of signify that they're together. The Fiendsmith cards are just really powerful right now. I like the Fiendsmith cards with Malice, because this is why I feel that we're not really thinking too hard when we play something like Malice, because there are some that are still playing like without the Fiendsmith cards, but I think that you get really rewarded by playing them, because if you get Lancia, you're like, okay, I'm going to use Fiendsmith cards, and you can't Bishtil me. That's crazy, right? Like, the mind games to be like, you have to drop Lancia in draw phase, and if you don't, I'm going to be able to just, like, do what I want to do. You're going to Lancia, and I'm going to talent you, right? Like, that sucks. So then you're like, all right, I'm going to drop it in draw phase. So you have to either take out your Bistils or keep in with it and hope that you see one of them. And so then you open Lancia Bistil and you like drop Lancia, and then they just activate Engraver, right? So the Fiendsmith cards and Malice alone, I think, is the all-time best variant of the deck right now, just because it gives you multiple pushes through Lancia. But I still think that Malice right now, it's like, neither deck is going to be tier 0, right? They're not oppressive. They just aren't, right? They're not like super crazy, over the top, gonna blow you out immediately, right? Like, there's so many counters to both of these decks. And I think that's a healthy format. That's great. And Ryzeal has 41% of the tops in the meta right now. Malice has 21%. That's a 20% difference. But we do see Malice slowly creeping up every day. So that's really interesting, because like Malice was down at 16% and Ryzeal was at 39. Now Ryzeal's at 41 and Malice is at 21. So we're seeing a lot of tops out of both decks. And I do think that they both stand next to each other. Objectively, Ryzeal Fiendsmith deck is still the best deck in the game right now. But I don't really think that you're at a loss if you get either one. I think either is a great option, and this is very unique because last format we only had Snake. It was you buy Snake or you don't play the game, right? Until YCS, it was Snake, 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 Snake. Like every single round, bro. And it's pretty crazy now when you get like Yubel, Tenpai, Kashtira, Ryzeal, Malice, Tenpai, Malice, Tenpai, Ryzeal, right? Like, your matchups aren't just like one deck. Like, they're in a pool of about 5 decks, but it still gives enough breath of fresh air into the room, and it makes the event enjoyable, at least for me. So I think that's really cool. I think the format right now is really healthy. I know some people aren't like a huge fan of this format, but same point, I think this is the best place the game's been in a very long time, minus mulch armies, but even with mulch armies, you can make like a crazy half board or something and be fine, right? Like, I don't even think it's like that big of a deal with the mulch armies anymore. Obviously, they can still be annoying, and you can lose to your opponent activating double Charmy on you. That happened to me at the regional. I was sick, you know? But, I mean, it is what it is. There are a lot of very toxic cards in the game. Do they need to be banned? Yeah, they do. Lancia, Shifter, the Mulch Armies, they all gotta go. I hate lingering effects so much. Dweller can go too. But it's one of those things where I think right now, the game is definitely in a very good position, and I'm glad to be a part of it right now. Striker, this is still going to be just like a rogue deck. I think it's fine, but there's just not a way that you can prove to me that I wouldn't just play one of these well before I play the Striker, right? Because the deck itself is like, okay, but like Striker as an engine is doing way better than just playing Striker by itself, right? So objectively, I just could not get behind just playing Striker. Lab, if you're a competent lab player and you really know the deck, I would say it's top of tier 2. If you don't know what you're doing with the deck, this deck is like almost unplayable, right? So even like the Fiendsmith variant of Lab, very strong. You can loop things like Karma Cannon, use your rollbacks to be able to get to what you need to, get to Sanctums really easy, get to your DDGs really easy. Lab is always going to be the crazy deck in a format that can pop off at any moment. And it still will be. So if you're really good with the deck, still play it. Still a very good deck. Absolutely. Know that people are on Bell, but other than that, better have it. There's also lines to play around Bell, right? You welcome first for the Lovely, and then you can go ahead and big welcome, and then summon Lady, bring back Lady, rip a card with a Lovely, and then summon the Lady. So there's a lot of really nice lines because your opponent cannot respond to your normal traps once you have Lovely out. So if you really understand the deck, it's a very strong deck right now. We're going to turbo through a couple of these just for the sake of time in the video. Rogue, don't. And then I would say the Musket deck is still going to be Rogue. Last format, it was doing like okay and it like popped up a little bit, but like I feel the second that people understand this deck's around, it does not perform. It does not perform at all. And it's like fine, but even if you're gonna play like the Musket variant, I feel like now you're just playing like the Cash Tier variant, the Tenpai variant, the Bell variant of Fiendsmith, right? Like there's just other variants that are just like so much better. So definitely very interesting, but I just don't respect this too much. It's definitely like top of Rogue, maybe like bottom of tier 2, but I would even rather play like a Chimera variant with the Azumina cards over this right now. It's just not very good. Marincess is still not going to do it right now. Purely, it could be a Rogue if you make like an 8-mat Noir and pass and hope for the best, right? No one's really on Goddess right now, so I guess you're in a better position, but like if everyone's going to be on Droll next format too, you're in a rough spot. Also, Impulse on Yeep is just crazy, right? So not very healthy for that deck if you're trying to play it. Definitely a brutal time. Salad, don't even cope. Don't cope. I get so many comments and they're just like, Salad's the best deck. How could you put it in don't? Don't. Don't. Dragon. Now, this is going to be more so, like, as of right now, these two are basically the same. It's just, like, the Bistral control deck, which is, like, fine. I feel like it's a really good matchup into Malice, for sure, because Regain's a house against that matchup. It's, like, okay into, like, Ryziel Fiendsmith, but these both together can just sit in Rogue, because, like, that deck is always, like, something you got to keep in the back of your mind that could just spring up at any time. But until we get, like, better Dragon support, it's probably not going to be anything over Rogue. Plant, this is just bottom of Rogue. Unless you're in Europe, then it's tier 0. Dark World, I want to put it in tier 2 so bad, but, like, it's just Rogue, man. Like, Bistral's Droll, Shifter, it's just... It topped something recently. It was like a regional, but like still, it's still not at a point where it could be considered good. There's too many counters to this deck, even with Fiendsmith cards. Like, there's too many counters to this deck. Would not be playing Thunder, would not be playing literally Runic anything. Snake, I mean, like, it depends on what you define as Snake, right? Like, it's not just pure Snake anymore, it's just a don't deck. If we're talking about, like, the Fire King Kashtira deck, I would say it's tier 2. I think that deck's really cool and really underexplored. Having a lot of options, including Impulse on the deck, I think is really solid. I'm definitely interested to see where that one goes, but that's definitely like tier 2 right now. Sword Soul, it'd be somewhere in Rogue. Sword Soul is always one of those decks that can randomly pop up. Shout out to Richard Carter, just getting second at like 1,000-person regional not too long ago with Sword Soul. Absolutely absurd. What an animal. That was crazy. But I don't know. Sword Soul is just always one of those decks where I'm like, yeah, they search Protoss, right? Like, they could do that. Another deck that realistically just searches Protoss that low-key has been doing pretty good, I would put it like middle of tier 2, is Ritual Beast. Yeah, Lancia is a card, but like you better draw it, right? So I've been seeing this deck at top tables, even at regionals lately, and I'm kind of like, wow. Like, the deck still is just like, we're going to play the game, right? And at the very worst, we're going to summon a Protoss and call Light this format, right? Light's just crazy right now. You can call Dark too, but like calling Light's insane. The Millennium deck, it's probably still in the middle of tier 2 somewhere. It's like a really cheap deck too, and it surprisingly does very well. But right now, Shifter's kind of like a lot worse. Like, it's fine, but it's like in a really rough spot for itself right now. So this is kind of what carried the deck through Snake format, and I think right now it's a little weaker. This deck, Lightsworn would not play. The Sprite deck is just gonna be in Rogue. It's just like Sprite Frog, right? So trying to get like the standard board with a double cross and Toad. It's okay. But like there's so many decks right now that just don't do anything realistically. Like you could play them and like they could be your pet deck. But at the end of the day, if these don't really perform well, then there's no reason to really play them. Mimigul, I respect this deck a lot. It's going middle tier 2. This deck's crazy. If you let it go off turn 1, it's a scary deck to recover from. So just make sure that you have a game plan for this if you see it, and at least that you know what the cards do, right? Because like you could run into this deck and easily get 2-0'd. It's kind of scary, especially if you're playing like cash cards and they're just like, here are monsters, right? Like it's kind of not great. But the deck itself is very scary. If you're playing Impulse, it's fine, right? Because you just Impulse and all their monsters are turned off. But other than that, it's pretty scary. Memento is definitely going to be like the middle of tier 1.5. I think this is really good. This deck is really scary right now in a room. If you play against somebody who really knows what they're doing with this deck, it can be pretty terrifying because the deck itself does a lot. Putting this deck under Lancia is still really strong too because it can't really do too much, but this don't end on a small board. I think this deck alone, though, can definitely do a lot of damage into a format, and it's definitely a worthy pickup right now. The next thing here is going to be Mermail. It's going to be up next to Mr. Rugi in Lab. I think this deck is still one of those things where, like, with the new card, too, it can just outright kill you, or it just loses to itself. Definitely a very cool deck, but, like, I want to see what more it can do. I feel like if you go second against this deck, and you're just kind of at a worse spot with hand traps, you might just lose to the hand rips, which is definitely understandable, and this deck can be very scary. If you go first, you just automatically kill this deck. But at the end of the day, like, it's just one of those things where if you're playing against the Mermail deck, you're playing against a Ritual deck, you're playing against, like, the Mimigul, any of these decks, you can easily get caught off guard. You just really need to understand what each of these decks do, and I feel like you'll be fine. Because what happens is a lot of people go to tournaments, they're like, oh, I got the tech for Ryziel, I got the tech for Malice, it's fine, we'll beat those decks. Then you run into, like, Mermail, Mitsurugi, Ritual, and you're like, I forgot what these cards do, I'm gonna lose. And you need to have a good understanding of what tier 2 is and how to beat it, so that way when you end up getting paired into one of these, you're like, okay, I'm okay, right? Like, I'm good. Like, I know how to interact with these decks, I'm okay. And I feel like that's one of the biggest shortcomings that I've been seeing lately. And then Rogue for Vanquish Soul. It could come back, but I would need to see more support for it. But let me know where you put some of these decks. I'm definitely interested to hear about it. This is a pretty updated tier list as far as the one that I feel like is going to be pretty accurate. Especially like Memento. I feel like this is just one that you should be picking up if you have it. If you have the ability to play this deck right now, I think this deck is very, very strong. Especially if you don't want to buy like Ryziel or Malice. This is another really good pickup option right now. But everyone have a wonderful night. I'll catch you all in the next video. Thank you all so much. Later.